Welcome back to FordeeTV. I'm your host, Fordee. It's been a while, guys, and I apologize for the hiatus. I've been working a lot, putting in a lot of hours, and in my free time, looking for Mrs. Right, and once in a while, looking for Mrs. Right now. But anyways, let's get into today's tutorial. So today's tutorial is going to be about Lomo photography techniques inside of Adobe Photoshop. Now there's different ways to do this, and by the way, I'm using CS6. However, if you're using a different version, these techniques still should apply. There's different techniques. I'm going to show you one. Obviously there are others, but hopefully you like this technique. I've got this picture I took down in Venice Beach of this Buddha statue on the boardwalk in front of someone's house. I think it looks pretty cool. It's going to work for this example. Obviously, you can use any picture you want. Some of the settings in the sliders will be different for your shot, so go ahead and adjust to taste. I'm going to show you what works for this photograph. So the first thing we're going to want to do is cross-process the colors. In order to do so, we're going to want to create an adjustment, curves adjustment layer. Excuse me. In order to do so, we can come up to the adjustments pane here and click on curves. Alternatively, we can come into the layers pane, click on the adjustments icon here, and go down to curves. I'll click on curves up here this time and apply it. We want to switch on over to our red channel here, and when we do so, we're going to boost red in the shadows, and we're going to pull red out of the highlights by creating a reverse S-curve as seen here. Now exactly where you place these pickers or dots within this S-curve, that's entirely up to you. Can you bump it all the way up here, etc.? You know, it's going to look different depending on where you put it, so go ahead and play with it. I'm going to go ahead and switch to the green channel, and I'm going to replicate that reverse S-curve just like I did in the red channel. Next, I'll switch on over to the blue channel, and I'm going to draw an S-curve. I'm going to bring down the blues, or increase the blues in the shadows, and I'm going to drop them in the shadows and bump them up in the highlights. Let me hide this adjustments properties window right here and show you a before and after of that adjustment layer. So now you can see that we've cross-processed the colors. The next thing we're going to want to do is increase saturation. And in order to increase saturation, if you're using CS4 and above, you're going to want to go ahead and use a vibrancy adjustment layer. If you're using CS3 and below, you can go ahead and use the hue saturation adjustments layer and just bump up your saturation. Doesn't look as good as the vibrancy adjustment layer, and let me show you what I'm talking about. So I'll go ahead and set this, I don't know, maybe to 50 and 50 worked for this particular photograph. I'll go ahead and hide the properties, show you a before and after. Next, I'm going to leave it hidden, and I'm going to go ahead and add a hue and saturation adjustments layer. When I do that, I'm going to bump up the saturation, I don't know, maybe to 27, somewhere around there. Maybe drop it down a little bit. I'll show you a before and after here. I'll switch back over the vibrancy layer. You see the vibrancy layer just gives it a little bit more punch. It doesn't look as overly saturated as increasing the saturation in the saturation layer, but hey, if all you have is CS3 and below, that's going to be your workaround. I'm going to go ahead and delete this hue and saturation layer and move on. The next thing we're going to want to do is increase contrast by blowing out our highlights and clipping our shadows. In order to do that, we're going to want to create another curves adjustment layer. So we can do that the same way, coming up to the adjustments panel, clicking on the curves icon, and for this, we're going to want to be working in the RGB channel. We're going to want to draw in an S-curve, so we're going to want to bring down our shadows and pump up our highlights. So we can really overly exaggerate this here. I'll show you a before and after. Now obviously, because these are adjustment layers, we can always come back on over here, double click on the adjustment, and we can make changes because this is non-destructive. So if this is not exactly where we want to be, we can always come back and make decisions later, right? So the next thing that we're going to want to do is we're going to want to go ahead and create a vignette. In order to create a vignette, I'm going to go ahead, come down here to the layer, create new layer icon, or I can come up to the top menu, click on layer, say new, and layer. When I do that, I can name the layer if I want. If I had clicked on it down here in the layer palette, it wouldn't have given me the option to name it. However, of course, we can always come over here, double click on the name, and rename it if we so desire. So to create a vignette here, what I'm going to do, I can press D on my keyboard. It will set my foreground and background colors to the default. I'm going to press Option, Delete on my keyboard, which is going to fill this layer with my foreground color. Alternatively, I could have went up to the edit menu, went down to fill, and then selected use black, or foreground color if your foreground color is set to black, etc., etc. I'll cancel out of this and I'll switch on over to my marquee tool. In fact, my elliptical marquee tool. If you have it set to the rectangular marquee tool, you can click and hold here and change to elliptical marquee. Otherwise, you can press Shift M on your keyboard and it will cycle through the different marquee tools. I'm going to click and drag, and I'm going to drag out a elliptical marquee to be roughly the majority of this screen. If I click while I am holding down my mouse button with my left mouse click, I can press spacebar on my keyboard to reposition this elliptical marquee before I let go of that left mouse button. So I'm going to drag this over here. I'm going to get it to fill more or less the majority of my screen. I'm going to let go. I'm going to come back down over here to my layers palette and I'm going to click on this layer mask icon. If I hold down Option and press it, it's going to fill this layer mask like so. If I double click on the layer mask here, for example, let's say this was inverted. Maybe this is what you see because you didn't press Option when you clicked on the layer mask. That's fine. You can come double click on over here, click on invert, and that's going to look pretty good. As far as the feathering is concerned, that depends on the resolution of the photo that you're using. This particular photo was shot with a Canon 7D, I believe. So you know what? We can probably bump this up to 400 pixels, somewhere around there, and it's going to look pretty good. This is a before and after with this particular vignette. And again, we can change the opacity. If we click on this black layer here, we can drop this opacity. Let's say if we dropped it to 60, if we dropped it to 20, etc. We're going to see how that makes a change as harsh as this is going to be applied. I'm going to leave it at 100 for now, and I'm going to create another layer, which we're going to add some film grain to this photo. So I click on the new layer icon here in the layer palette. I'm going to go ahead and go up to the edit menu. I'm going to select fill and I'm going to select use 50% gray from the menu here and say OK. Next, I'll come up to my filter, go down to noise and select add noise. In my Add Noise dialog box, I'll go ahead and make sure the distribution is set to Gaussian and set to monochromatic. And then as far as the amount, you can play with this. I like 200% for this particular photograph. Obviously, you can change that value and see how it looks in yours. Well, when we do that, we cannot see the image below. In order to do so, we need to change our blend mode over here in the layers palette. I'll change it from normal, set it to multiply, and then, as you can see, this is way too grainy, way too dark. In order to fix that, we can change the opacity of this layer from 100%. In this particular photograph, I think it looked pretty good at, I don't know, 15, maybe 20%. Now, keep in mind, at 15 and 20% in this screen recording, it's not going to look too grainy. Also, because remember that this image is only at 17.1% right here. But if I blow this up, if I go ahead and press Command plus, and I move this image here, you're going to see this is pretty grainy, right? I can come back up here to View, and I can say fit to screen by pressing Command 0 or clicking on it right there. I'll go ahead and switch this back down to 15% because that's what I think looked pretty good. The next thing that I'm going to do is I want to take all of these layers and create a new layer based on all of the current layers I have selected. Or not selected, but I have within my layer menu. In order to do so, there's a keyboard shortcut command. It's Command, Option, Shift, and E. E is an egg. I'll go ahead and press that. You'll see it thinks for a second, and now I have a copy of all the layers that I had here within my stack in one single layer right here. The next thing that I want to do is I want to blur my outside edges and then sharpen my inside edges. In fact, if I wanted to use the same vignette or the same marquee selection that I use here, I could press Command on my keyboard and click on this layer mask right here, which will allow me to use the same selection. I don't want to use that selection, so I'm going to press Command D on my keyboard to undo. I'm going to go and make sure that my elliptical marquee tool is selected. I'm going to click and drag, and I'm going to basically set this around Buddha, you know? So, I don't know, maybe somewhere around here, give or take. I'll go ahead and let go. The next thing I want to do is this current selection is not feathered. And in fact, I can use the left and right arrow keys on my keyboard maybe to reposition this a little bit after the fact. If I come up to the select menu up here, select modify and go to feather, I can feather this selection. Now for this particular photograph, again, depending on the resolution, the amount of pixels in the photograph is going to determine how much you want to feather your selection. Because this is quite a large photograph, I'm going to set this feather radius to the maximum at 250 pixels and press enter. You'll see this particular selection changed a little bit on the screen because of the feathering. So right now everything inside of this marquee is selected. I'm going to come up to filter, I'm going to select sharpen and smart sharpen. The smart sharpen dialog box will appear. I'll go ahead and set the amount to 180, the radius to 1.2 pixels. Now again, this is going to be dependent on what type of photograph you're using. If you're using a DSLR, like a 7D, a 5D photo, etc., that has lots of pixel data, etc., you can get away with values like this. If you pump these up pretty high, it's going to start getting pixelated, etc., and you don't want to do that. I'm going to select OK, and it's going to make the Buddha just a little bit more sharp, or a little sharper, right? I'm going to press actually, you know what I'm going to do? Before I blur the outsides, I'm going to create a new adjustment layer. In fact, it's going to be a curves adjustment layer. I'll come up here while this selection is selected and press on the curves adjustment layer, and you'll notice it automatically made a layer mask that based on the selection that I had. I'll go over here, and what I want to do, I just want to make Buddha pop a little bit. You'll notice as I bring this up, it's increasing the brightness in the midtones based on this layer mask selection. I'm going to drag this down a little bit. I'm just trying to get it pop just a little bit. I'll go ahead and close the properties of that selection. Next, I'll come over here to the layer mask of this brand new curves layer that we selected, hold down Command on my keyboard, click on it, and now I have that selection back. The next thing I want to do is invert the selection. There is a keyboard shortcut command, which is Command Shift I believe, which is correct. You can also get to it by going up to select and selecting inverse, Shift Command I, exactly. So now what we can do is now the Buddha is not selected, everything else is selected. If we come up here to filter, we select blur, and we go down to Gaussian blur, we can set this, I don't know, maybe 15, maybe 20 pixels, something like that. Let's say 18, somewhere around there. I'll go ahead and say OK. Oops. I'm going to press Command Z on my keyboard and realize that I actually want to have this layer selected to do the blur. So I press Command Z to undo that blur that I applied. I selected the layer that has the combination of all the layers below. I still have this selection available. I'll go up to Filter, select Blur, Gaussian Blur. I'll set it to 18 pixels. I'll say OK. You'll notice everywhere here is pretty blurry. I'll go ahead and press Command D on my keyboard to deselect my current selection. I'll drag this slider down here. I'll select this original layer. I'll press Command J on my keyboard to make a copy of the layer that I have selected. When I do that, I'm going to click and I'm going to drag this all the way up to the top. I'm going to place this at the top of my layer hierarchy. Now I can toggle this on and off to see a before and after. So this is the before and this is the after. This is one style of lomographic photography techniques that you can apply inside of Adobe Photoshop. Remember, if you have CS3 and below, you're not going to have the vibrancy adjustment layer. However, you can use a hue saturation adjustment layer in its place to achieve a very similar effect. Guys, I hope you liked this tutorial. If you did, please comment, rate, subscribe, etc. Share the video with your friends. Until next time, I'm Fordee and I'm out.